Welcome to the 30-day AI Automation Pro Challenge, the challenge where you become an AI Automation Pro in only 30 days, no matter where you start. Yesterday and the day before, we talked about how to get the first paying customers and what you actually say on the very first call once you have the chance to speak to a potential customer. And today, in day 22, I want to show you how you can find automation potential within a business. This is of course important because it is not always super clear what actually you should automate. Sometimes your customer himself is pretty unsure what actually should be automated in the first place. And then it is important that you have a clear framework how you can spot the best automation potential so that there's the best outcome for your client, but also for you. All that is covered in that video. So let's get started. How do I spot automation potential in businesses? My personal approach. And I want to begin with the question, what actually do I mean with automation potential? It is understanding the client's business problems, the needs and the wishes. It is finding out where an AI automation could solve these problems or fulfill those needs. It is finding out if you are capable of developing such a solution, and it is also about finding out how serious the business owner is about working with you and if he has the budget to pay for it. So all that is what I understand under automation potential, and when all that is crystal clear and checked off, you have a pretty decent project. So let's have a look how we make this happen. This is how I personally handle that. Everything starts with a first call, and there it's all about getting a first impression and finding out what truly matters to your client. It is also about demanding needed information to understand the client's processes. Because in the first call, as we learned that yesterday, you already talk quite a lot about the processes, what is important to your customer, and most of the time the customer will also mention what kind of process he wishes to have automated. This call typically takes between 30 to 60 minutes, and afterwards you come to the analysis and research phase. And here it is all about looking at the provided inputs and understanding the involved processes. It is about researching and estimating feasibility and building super simple prototypes. And for that phase, I typically take 1 to 3 days. We will talk exactly about that phase in more detail in a second so that you understand what actually is happening within the analysis and research phase. And after this is done, there's a second call where I'm basically presenting my very first AI automation approach that I selected to solve the problems and processes mentioned earlier. It is about providing a realistic estimate regarding the costs and the time horizon, and it is about scheduling meetings with other people involved in these processes. And that second call typically takes between 60 to 90 minutes. And in the next step, I want to talk about exactly that, the second step, what is happening and what am I doing in the analysis and research phase. Because in my opinion, this is an essential step in the beginning of any project, and this already strongly determines the success of your project. So let's have a look what we actually do in that phase. And I want to divide this into 2 different scenarios. We have the case where we have a clear goal. So our customer clearly mentioned one process that he wishes to be automated, or several processes. But we also have the case that the customer mentioned several processes, but it is not crystal clear yet which actually should be automated. And then this is your task to find out. And we will talk about that in a second. But first we talk about exactly that scenario where we have a clear goal. Then it is about understanding exactly how the client process works right now. So as of today, how is the client doing the process that he wishes to be automated? And you do that by asking the following questions. What is actually happening and in which order? How is it done right now and who is involved? And which software is involved and can it be integrated, for example, via n8n? So these are the main questions that you should be able to answer in that research phase, because when you do that, it means you have a crystal clear picture about the client process, and this is a needed precondition so that you are actually able to automate the process in the next steps. So once you understand the client's process, it is not always the case that you know how to solve that right away. And then it is about researching possible solutions. What do I mean with that? Oftentimes you understand the client's process and you have a pretty vague idea how you could automate and handle that, but there are still some things missing, maybe a tool or a certain integration that you never have used before. And in that case, it is important that you do the research and that you do some easy testing just to verify if you can actually make this happen. And after this is done, it is about building a very simple prototype that already proves or disproves the general concept. Of course, this is something personal and some people might do that differently. But I always try to build a very simple, basic prototype that more or less already shows the end result. It is not the final product, it is not the final automation, and many things are missing and are not considered yet. But in my opinion, it is a pretty good approach to just try to already verify the general concept very soon. Because if you are able to build such a simple prototype, it is way simpler to further develop that into the final solution. But it also shows you if the general concept is just not working. Because sometimes you or your client, you think that a certain approach works perfectly to solve a certain task, but already with such a simple prototype, you can easily and quick find out if this is actually true or not. And because of that, I like to work with these prototypes. So to sum it up, it is about proving the concept. And when we look at such a very first prototype, this is something that I also showed you already during the challenge. And we look then at the final result. We see that this is of course way less complicated than that. But as I already explained earlier in the challenge, this is actually to 80-90% already representing pretty good what the final workflow will be doing. And if you manage to set up such a simple first prototype, everything gets easier. You have easier conversation with your customer because you can already show something, and also your customer already gets a pretty good idea what the final workflow will look like, how the results will look like, how this is working. And if you already discover here that the general concept is just not working, it is way easier to come up with an alternative solution. And most of the time, something like that, a very first prototype, can be built in, let's say, 30-60 minutes, and it delivers you already quite a lot of insights and value for your project. Because of that, I highly recommend to always go with a first prototype before you start developing such a complex final solution. All right, and as I mentioned earlier, there's also the other case where there is no clear goal. So in the first call, your customer maybe mentioned some things that are important or that he wishes to have automated, but it is not crystal clear yet what actually should be automated. And now I want to cover that process, what you do in that case to come up with the best solution for your customer, but also for you. All right, so the client mentioned several processes, but nothing specific. What do you do now? This is exactly what the lecture is about now. We try to identify one target process that you are going to automate. Okay, and this is critical here. Just focus on one in the very first step. I know it is tempting to solve all your clients' problems in one go, but trust me, it is just good practice to start with one process, especially if you never worked with the client. It just makes things easier. And when you manage to solve that very first process and you automate everything, then you can move on to the others. And the next question then is, okay, how do you actually make that decision which process you should begin with? And now I want to give you my aspects that I consider to be able to make that decision. First of all, it is about the biggest impact regarding revenue, cost, time, and growth. So what do I mean with growth? For example, social media growth or the growth of a certain email list, things like that. And this is, of course, the first strong indicator that a process is worth automating if it has just a strong direct impact on the client's business. So this is criteria number one. Number two is the feasibility. Can I learn it fast enough? And what do I mean with that? Oftentimes you get a process presented or several processes presented, and you can already tell that process A is doable and process B could be doable, but I have absolutely zero idea yet how to do it. In that case, if process A is also pretty useful and impactful, I would highly recommend to begin with A, because it is easier for you to present a fast, good result. And then once you already established a good relationship and reputation with that customer, you can take your time to also work on process B. But in the beginning, I recommend to go with something that you already know that you can solve it. The next important aspect that I consider is what is most important to my client. And now you might think, okay, this is probably always that one, the biggest impact, but this is not necessarily true. Maybe your client just wants a certain task automated because it is an emotional thing or it just matters to him, even though it might not be so impactful. And of course, you also consider something like that in your decision, with process you start, because if it matters to your client, it also should matter to you. And the last point to consider is the capacity. Do you actually have capacity for the project? This of course doesn't matter in the very beginning if you don't have any clients, but I can already tell you after a while, when you work on several projects, you also have to consider your capacity. And if there are two processes, one will take you 2 to 3 weeks to finish and the other can be done in a couple of days, you might also want to think about the time. Also, if your client mentioned a very small budget, you want to go with the process that you can automate faster, because otherwise it's just a mismatch between your customer's capability to pay for it and the time that you need to actually pull off the project. And all these 4 criteria and aspects are what I consider to make a decision with which process I actually want to start, and then I make a suggestion to my customer exactly based on these aspects. All right, and to finish off the chapter, I want to talk about what is the perfect process to automate with n8n. Of course, this is a personal preference. Other people might see that differently, but in my opinion, these are the aspects that make a process just perfect to automate it with n8n. Number 1, it's a process that truly matters to your client. Okay, so if it is something that you think would be cool to automate, but your client just doesn't give a shit about it, it's not the perfect process. So you want your customer to be excited about it and to consider it important. Number 2, you are able to understand the entire process after spending time with it. So oftentimes during the very first call, when your customer mentions and describes a certain process, you will experience that you have no idea what your customer is talking about, and this is totally fine. But you should be able to understand the entire process at least after spending some time with it and after your customer provided you some additional information or a description. And if you already recognize that there is no way that you will ever understand this because it's way too complicated, just don't work with that process. Select something else. Trust me, it just makes your life so much easier. The next point is that the process can be viewed and described as isolated process. This is very important because if you want to automate a certain process and you just realize that there are a million parties involved and there are connections and relationships to thousands of different parties, it is of course pretty difficult to automate that process. You want something that you can describe pretty easily, isolated from the rest of the organization. And also that you can only find out by truly understanding the process and spending time with it. Because of that, take your time for that second phase, the research and analysis phase, to truly understand your customers' processes. And the last point I want to mention here is the following. You already have a vague idea in your head how you could solve it. So this is also something that makes a process just perfect. If you already hear the process and your customer describing it, and you already have a first idea in your head how you could pull that off. It will not always be the case that you know right away how to solve it, but you will pretty soon develop a good feeling for different processes and how to handle them. And this is of course a huge advantage, because then you can already answer live in the very first call how you would handle that, and you can give a first estimate, and it makes just the entire collaboration and process faster. All right, to sum it up one more time, what makes the perfect process? It is something that truly matters to your client. You understand the underlying process. It can be viewed and described isolated from the rest of the organization, and you already have a vague idea in your head how you can actually solve the task. All right, that's it for today's video for day number 22 of the 30-day AI Automation Pro Challenge. And tomorrow we keep going by learning how I actually manage AI automation projects, what is happening when do I send the contract, when do I send the invoices, and so on. This is also something that is of course super crucial when it comes about making AI automation your business. Because of that, we cover it tomorrow. That's it for today's video. Let me know in the comments how the challenge is going. We see us tomorrow. Take care and goodbye.